Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in 1887 Wyoming, the hermit farmer who turned his water well into a death trap. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1887, and the high plains of Wyoming stretched out like a desolate ocean of wind and dust. Settlements were scattered, mostly small ranches clinging to the rough land between Cheyenne and the northern cattle trails. The railroad had not yet reached some of these valleys, and communication came slowly, by horseback, by rumor, or by the next wagon passing through. It was in this quiet emptiness that a man named Elias Finch built his homestead. Finch was a reclusive farmer, said to have purchased his land through a distant cousin after leaving a failed ranching venture near Rawlins. He rarely spoke, kept no livestock beyond a few goats, and tended a meager patch of barley and jowar that barely grew in the dry soil. His neighbors, few as they were, described him as a man who looked past you, not at you. At that time, tensions between homesteaders and cattle interests were rising sharply, the same hostilities that would soon erupt into the Johnson County War, which local newspapers had begun whispering about even then. Men like Finch were seen as fence builders, outsiders who divided open range that wealthy cattlemen claimed as their own. Whether through fear or defiance, Elias kept to himself, digging deep into the earth for water, and later for something else entirely. The first written notice of Finch appears in a Laramie Sentinel registry, May 1887. Mr. E. Finch has established residence by the North Ridge, claims 120 acres of barren soil, and is believed to be living alone. Vailers who passed his property remembered a strange sight, a circular stone well, wide enough for a wagon wheel, covered by a wooden lid fastened with iron hinges. Finch, it was said, guarded this well obsessively. He had been seen drawing water only at night, always with a lantern, and never letting another man near it. By autumn, 2 cowhands from a neighboring spread failed to return from a delivery run that took them along Finch's trail. The sheriff at Rock Creek sent word to check for signs of bandits, but few dared ride toward the hermit's claim. The country was already whispering about missing men, about the smell near Finch's property, and about the sound that came from the well on cold nights when the wind blew just right. When spring returned to Wyoming in 1888, the snow melted into deep ruts along the dirt roads and gullies. With it came the renewed talk of Elias Finch, whose strange habits had become more than just gossip. Letters from the sheriff's office in Carbon County mentioned him in passing, a reclusive settler, uncooperative during an earlier land survey, known to chase away riders who approached his fences. Finch's cabin sat low against the hillside, constructed of uneven pine logs with gaps stuffed full of mud and straw. The stone well beside it was unlike any in the county, lined meticulously with brick rather than fieldstone, its opening rimmed with iron. Local ranchers found that odd. Such craftsmanship was expensive and rare. No reason a hermit should spend that much time on a well unless he's hiding something in it, remarked a foreman named Abner Colt, whose testimony appeared years later in a faded deposition. The isolation of Finch's property mirrored the growing distrust across the plains. Ranchers accused small settlers of stealing cattle. Settlers accused ranchers of poisoning wells. It was an uneasy time, the same tension that historians later traced through the events of the Johnson County War, a reminder of how fast a dispute over fences could turn to bloodshed. Finch, by all accounts, represented the paranoia of that period in human form. A field hand named Thomas Reeves passed by Finch's land in April and left a recollection in his diary. He stood by that well with a rope in his hand and stared as I rode past. I waved. He didn't. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to have seen him. Weeks later, Reeves reported to the deputy that he'd noticed buzzards circling above the ridge behind Finch's cabin. The deputy rode out with a partner but returned after dusk, claiming the property was abandoned. They found the door barred from the inside, and faint smoke rose from the chimney. "Could be he's just keeping to himself," one said, though neither man dared knock. That summer, more cowhands disappeared. First, Joel McKinnon, a 19-year-old drover, then Sam Cuddy, whose horse was found grazing near the river 3 days later, saddle torn and reins cut. Word spread quickly through the saloons and bunkhouses. Finch's well was cursed. Newspapers refused to print the rumors, but the Laramie Sentinel eventually ran a column in late July. Local farmers express unease regarding a settler by the northern ridge whose property has become the source of superstition and whispered warning. As the dry heat deepened, neighbors began to keep their distance. Wells were checked for tampering. Men carried rifles even when fetching water. In the heart of that growing dread, Elias Finch vanished from sight. For nearly 3 months no one claimed to have seen smoke from his chimney, nor heard the creak of his bucket at night. But one thing did change. Travelers began to speak of a strange new smell drifting from that part of the valley, something faintly metallic, carried by the wind from the direction of Finch's claim. By September of 1888, the county clerk's records show that the Finch homestead was officially in arrears, no taxes paid, no correspondence received. Still, no one dared visit the land. The only man who attempted to ride near the ridge was Marshal Deacon Hartley, a veteran of the old frontier campaigns, known for his calm disposition. His notes, preserved later in the Rock Creek archives, reveal how the legend truly began to take shape. Hartley described a late afternoon ride across the barren prairie, the low hum of wind through grass, the faint rasp of his horse's breath, and the slow appearance of Finch's crooked cabin beyond the ridge. He noticed that the well was uncovered, the wooden lid thrown aside, as though something had been dragged out or pushed in. He called out twice, receiving no reply. When he approached, the ground near the well was dark, as though soaked by something heavier than water. Inside the cabin, everything was strangely neat. The table held a tin plate with a crust of bread, a Bible open to the book of Amos, and beside it, a worn leather ledger with hand-drawn measurements. The sheriff later noted that Finch had drawn circles and arrows, notations about depth, sound, and silence. The handwriting was tidy, the ink faded. Hartley took one page and folded it into his pocket. It was never found again. Down in Rock Creek, the townspeople had their own theories. Some said Finch had gone mad from isolation, hearing the echoes in his well as voices from below. Others believed he'd struck a hidden aquifer rich with quicksilver, poisoning his mind slowly through exposure. A handful of older settlers tied the story to the growing unrest among ranchers, suggesting Finch might have been targeted in one of those early land disputes that would soon erupt into the Johnson County War. The timing fit, property lines blurring, tempers rising, and men disappeared, ring on both sides. In October, a group of ranchers, 3 men led by Abner Colt, decided to visit the Finch property. According to Colt's later statement, they found the cabin door unlatched and the inside empty, though the smell of damp earth was so heavy it hung like wet cloth. The well was the only thing untouched, the rope coiled neatly and the crank glistening with recent oil. Colt admitted he peered down, but could see only blackness. He dropped a stone and counted. "It didn't splash," he said. "It thudded." By the time the snow returned, Finch's name was spoken only in whispers. Mail riders avoided his route altogether, choosing a longer detour north. One evening, a passing wagoner claimed he saw a figure standing near the ridge, coat flapping in the wind. The man held a lantern and was looking straight into the well. When the wagoner raised his hand to hail him, the figure stepped backward and was gone. When the marshal returned in spring to recheck the site, he found the cabin roof partially collapsed, the doorway half buried in dust, and the well sealed tight again with iron nails. Someone had hammered them from the inside. The winter of 1889 brought hardship across much of Wyoming. Cattle herds died in the snow, rail lines froze, and the people who remained in the outlying settlements grew even more withdrawn. In that silence, the story of Elias Finch became less of a warning and more of a whisper passed between strangers, one of those tales told quietly near the stove after sundown. When the thaw came that spring, a small survey party from Fort Laramie was sent to chart the northern ridge. One of the men, Private James Hollow, later wrote in his field journal that they had stumbled upon a vacant property near the gulch, peculiar for the way the ground sinks slightly in a circle around a sealed well. Hollow's journal, now stored in a local archive, mentioned something else, a faint vibration beneath the soil, like running water, or distant movement. A few weeks after that discovery, another disappearance gripped the region. Dr. Silas Barlow, a traveling physician who treated ranch hands along the route from Rawlins to Rock Creek, failed to arrive at his scheduled stop. His horse was found grazing near Finch's Ridge, bridle intact, saddlebag missing. The doctor's medical kit, engraved with his initials, was recovered half-buried near the well. A single boot print was seen leading toward it. None returned. The sheriff's office convened a small posse to investigate. Among them was Abner Colt, now gray and heavy-set, still haunted by his earlier visit. He led them across the prairie in silence, muttering, "He's still there, somewhere under it." The men pried loose the iron nails sealing the well, each metallic groan echoing like thunder. When they pulled away the lid, a foul air rose from below, a smell of damp clay and rot so thick that several men turned away. What they saw inside was never officially recorded. The marshal's report later summarized it as remains of unidentifiable Peruan sons, numerous and in poor preservation. Others spoke less cautiously. One ranch hand claimed he saw bones stacked like cordwood, some still in torn clothing. Another said there were tools, a shovel, a length of chain, a lantern with soot frozen to its glass. A local newspaper published only a brief notice. Discovery of human remains north of the Laramie route. Investigation pending. Suspect presumed deceased. The case closed quietly, yet unease lingered. The Finch property was fenced off, then sold to a cattle company 2 years later, though no one ever lived there again. When the Johnson County War erupted not long after, Finch's name reappeared briefly in a regional column about frontier tragedies and private feuds. Some speculated that his paranoia had been rooted in those same tensions, a lone man caught between powerful neighbors and his own collapsing mind. But to those who'd stood near that well, the explanation felt too neat. One of the deputies years later told a young reporter, "We sealed it because of the smell, not because of the truth." The Finch property was officially condemned in late 1889. County maps marked it simply as Vacant Claim Number 47, and the surrounding ranches resumed their routines, though few ever rode close to the ridge. By then, much of Wyoming was in flux. The arrival of the railroad had begun to change everything. Land prices rose, cattle barons consolidated power, and smaller settlers vanished from record. In that swirl of shifting ownership, the story of Elias Finch should have faded, but it didn't. In 1890, Professor Jeremiah Wexler, a traveling geologist from Denver, passed through the area on a research expedition. His writings later appeared in the Rock Springs Courier under the column Notes from the Frontier's Edge. Wexler had heard the local talk and visited the site briefly. His entry was matter-of-fact, yet strange in its precision. The so-called Finch Well appears intentionally engineered beyond the means of a frontier farmer. Brickwork is uniform, the shaft unusually deep, perhaps 50 feet. Acoustic properties are peculiar. Sound travels downward and returns delayed, as if encountering chambers or hollows beneath. Those words stirred new curiosity. Within weeks, prospectors began wandering toward the ridge, hoping Finch's construction had concealed something valuable. An abandoned mine, a hidden vein of silver, or even buried payroll from the cattle companies of the North. None found anything of worth, though one man, Samuel Dorr, a prospector from Kansas, later wrote that he heard the echo of what he thought was a chain scraping stone far below. He left Wyoming the next day and never returned. The local clergy also took interest. Reverend Isaac Marin, from the small chapel in Medicine Bow, mentioned the case in a sermon that summer. "Evil doesn't always announce itself," he told his sparse congregation. "Sometimes it hides beneath the ground, waiting for our curiosity to dig it up again." According to church minutes, several parishioners afterward petitioned the county to have the well permanently sealed. Meanwhile, records show that the sheriff's office sent a brief report to Cheyenne asking for guidance on recovered remains of indeterminate number. The document was returned unsigned, with the note, "Insufficient identification. Recommend burial without further inquiry." That was the end of any official effort. For a few years, the land remained untouched. A traveling photographer passing through in 1892 took one of the last known images of the site, grainy, sepia-toned, showing a collapsed roof and a circle of stones half buried in tall jawar. The photo appeared in a minor exhibit decades later, labeled simply Wyoming Homestead, 1880s. In the same year, the Johnson County War reached its bloody climax. Newspapers focused on that instead, pushing the Finch affair deeper into obscurity. Yet even amid those headlines, one journalist in the Cheyenne Tribune recalled the old hermit. He wrote, "There was madness in the hills long before the gunmen came. We had one man who fought no one but his own shadow, and lost." That line was the last time Elias Finch's name appeared in print during his lifetime, or whatever remained of it. By 1893, most residents of Rock Creek had long stopped speaking the name Elias Finch aloud, though his story persisted in private recollection. Travelers still used the ridge as a landmark, calling it Finch Hollow. The name appeared on weather reports, freight notes, and even cattle drive maps, but almost no one remembered the man himself. Just the impression he'd left, that eerie sense of unease tied to the land. The region was changing quickly. The arrival of telegraph lines brought fragments of news from far-off towns, and with it came new settlers who knew nothing of the hermit or his well. Among them was Henry Rudd, a civil engineer from Ohio, hired to survey possible irrigation channels for the county. Rudd's journals, which survived in his family collection, recorded his first impression of Finch Hollow. "The air is strange here, stiller than other valleys, as if sound hesitates before crossing the ridge." While marking soil samples near the old property, Rudd and his assistant found several pieces of rusted metal protruding from the ground, iron rods bent in a spiral, half consumed by rust. They assumed it had been part of an abandoned windlass system for the well, but when they tried to pull one loose, they realized it was driven deep, nearly impossible to move. Beneath the surface, the ground trembled faintly, as though hollow below. Later that week, Rudd visited Sheriff Hartley, now retired, to ask if any geological features had been documented there. Hartley, grizzled and unwilling to talk, reportedly said, "Best leave that place buried. The county's got ghosts enough without waking his." When Rudd pressed further, Hartley mentioned that the last investigation, years earlier, had found timbers laid sideways down the shaft, suggesting it had been reinforced from below. Rudd made a sketch of the layout, labeling it "vertical shaft with possible side cham." That sketch was rediscovered in the 1930s among the possessions of a descendant, but by then the details had already slipped into folklore. Locals claimed the chamber contained a pit room where Finch had kept something secret, though whether it was bodies, tools, or treasure, no one could say. By autumn, wildfires swept across several Wyoming valleys, fueled by dry winds and unharvested jawar. Finch Hollow burned too. Contemporary reports note that the soil cracked from heat, revealing blackened stone beneath. Afterward, the area was declared unsafe for grazing. And yet some months later, a prospector camping near the ridge told of hearing a slow rhythm, like dripping water, from deep underground. He described it in a letter to his brother as the sound of something still living, or something refusing to die. When he rode into town the next day, his clothes smelled faintly of ash and damp iron. He told the barkeep, "If that man's gone, he didn't go far enough down." The following spring, 1894, the county issued new land leases to encourage settlers to reclaim burnt acreage. Finch Hollow was among them, though it carried a local reputation as unprofitable soil. Only one applicant appeared, a widower named Thomas Brigg, newly arrived from Nebraska with 2 mules and a single wagon. Brigg's signed deed survives in the Cheyenne Courthouse archives, bearing the words, "Parcel reconditioned after fire, previous structures unsalvageable." Brigg was not a superstitious man. In his first letter home, he described the land as lonely but sound. He rebuilt a cabin on the same site, using scorched timbers from the ruins and a few new boards hauled from town. He left the well sealed, writing that it looks proper enough but feels wrong. Over time, though, his letters grew shorter and stranger. The wind makes the well lid creak at night. I have placed stones on it, yet the sound persists. A smell lingers, though the soil's been turned and burned. Last night I thought I heard dripping water, but the bucket was dry. The postmaster in Rock Creek noted that Briggs stopped coming into town after midsummer. When a delivery rider checked the property that autumn, he found the cabin door open and the well lid cracked clean through the center. Inside the house, the table was set with 2 plates. There was no sign of struggle, but a chair was overturned. Deputy Miles Wren wrote in his report that he felt the ground shiver faintly while walking near the well. Believing it might collapse, he ordered the area fenced. No trace of Briggs was ever found, though a search party later located his mules grazing by the creek unharmed. The incident reignited talk of the old hermit. Newspapers briefly revisited the story, with one editor suggesting Finch's well might be part of a network of abandoned mine shafts. The Laramie Journal published an article of his, titled "The Hollow Beneath the Plains, Where Does the Water Go?" It cited early ranch accounts of sinkholes and subterranean springs common in that region, but the locals weren't convinced. A farmer named Rachel Dodd, who lived 2 miles away, gave a statement to a traveling salesman that later circulated widely. "At night, the ridge glows pale like frost, even when there's no moon. My boy says he sees a lantern swinging down there, but there's no one walking." The details spread quickly, adding a new layer to the legend, this idea of a light that flickered from nowhere, as though someone still tended the well. By the end of 1895, Finch Hollow was again abandoned. Grass grew over the path, and the fence rotted away. The county clerk finally marked the property as inactive claim, value nil. Yet travelers through that valley often reported an uneasy quiet. The wind seemed to stop altogether near the ridge, as if holding its breath. A retired schoolteacher, passing through years later, summed it up best. "Wyoming forgets fast, but that ridge she remembers." In the spring of 1896, a letter reached the Wyoming State Historical Society from a young journalist named Clara Winslow. She had come across the earlier investigations into the Finch case while researching unusual rural properties for a regional feature. Her request was polite but direct: permission to visit the site and document whatever remained. The Society granted it, and her report, published later that year in a small Denver periodical, became one of the last first-hand accounts before the well finally vanished from records. Clara's journey began from Cheyenne and took nearly 4 days by wagon. She wrote of the emptiness of the plains, the skeletal remnants of burned fences, and the way Finch Hollow seemed to pull the light inward rather than reflect it. Upon arrival, she found the old cabin mostly collapsed and the well ring choked with weeds. Yet despite the disrepair, she noted how carefully the surrounding stones had been arranged, as though by deliberate human effort long after the fire. "It felt," she wrote, "like visiting a grave that still expected company." Her article detailed what remained: fragments of brick near the rim, a broken pulley, the charred frame of a windlass, and faint initials carved into one of the stones, E.F., barely visible beneath soot. She also mentioned seeing a few stalks of jawar still growing wild, strange for land so barren. They bent in the wind as though pointing toward the well. Midway through her report, Clara compared the site's aura of secrecy to the lingering bitterness left by the Johnson County War, still fresh in regional memory only a few years later. "Out here," she wrote, "the line between feud and madness is thinner than smoke. Perhaps Finch, like so many men in this territory, simply went too long without hearing another voice." While camping overnight near the ridge, Clara claimed she awoke around midnight to the creak of metal. At first, she thought it was her wagon shifting. Then she saw it, the well's iron lid trembling slightly, as though pushed from beneath. She recorded the time and temperature in her notebook, calmly, methodically, but admitted that she packed and left before sunrise. When her article was printed, many dismissed it as frontier dramatization. Yet, It reignited interest in the Finch property. Letters poured into the Denver office asking for more details, some from amateur archaeologists, others from families tracing missing ancestors from the 1880s. Clara responded only once, in a brief editorial. I wrote what I saw. Whether it was the earth breathing or something else, I'll not claim to know. Years later, historians found her field sketches, drawings of the well from several angles, one labeled Movement 11:43 p.m. The faint pencil strokes showed the lid slightly ajar, and a thin trail of smoke or mist curling from the opening. The sketches were stored in the same archive that later housed relics from the Johnson County conflicts. For decades afterward, the two collections, one of real violence, one of remembered fear, sat quietly side by side. By 1897, Finch Hollow had become a destination for the curious. Drifters, photographers, and self-proclaimed historians passed through, each hoping to glimpse something that tied truth to the old tales. The property, though officially condemned, drew quiet fascination, especially after Clara Winslow's haunting report. That summer, a traveling photographer named Elmer Nash arrived from Montana. He specialized in daguerreotype portraits of frontier ruins, his work often appearing in small illustrated papers. Nash's surviving glass plates, found years later in a Cheyenne attic, included two exposures labeled The Finch Claim. The first shows the ridge from a distance, scattered stones, low brush, and the outline of a ruined fence. The second, more infamous image depicts the well itself. The photograph is blurred, likely from movement during exposure, but close inspection shows something odd. A faint, vertical streak rising from the well's mouth, like a pillar of smoke or light. In a letter to his editor, Nash described the site as unnaturally still, though the air moved all around it. He also noted that his assistant became nauseated after standing near the well for too long, claiming the ground felt soft, like the crust over a hollow. Nash left Wyoming the next morning, leaving behind his tripod and a box of plates. Around the same time, a local rancher named Caleb Moore reported strange disturbances on his adjoining land. His livestock began avoiding the lower pasture, circling away from the ridge as if repelled by scent. Moore told the Rawlins Gazette, "They won't graze near that old place. They just stand and look toward it, ears twitching, same as if they hear something we can't." In October, a storm rolled through the valley, bringing torrential rain and lightning that struck twice near the ridge. When Moore visited the site the next day, he found that the well lid had been flung aside and the surrounding soil caved inward, forming a shallow depression. Inside, rainwater glimmered faintly, though no one could tell how deep it went. The county sent 2 men to inspect: Deputy Wren, who had once investigated the Brigg disappearance, and a new clerk named Harold Finn. Wren wrote later that the depression was unnaturally circular, smooth, as though the earth had settled around something hollow. Finn, inexperienced and eager to impress, leaned too far over the rim and nearly fell. He swore afterward that he'd heard a hollow echo, followed by what sounded like a slow drag of metal over stone. After that report, the county sealed the site a final time. They covered it with timbers, dirt, and a thin layer of gravel, marking it only with a small wooden sign reading, "Unsafe ground, keep away." But people didn't keep away. In the years that followed, travelers occasionally found small tokens near the ridge: an old hat brim, a broken lantern, once even a torn scrap of a coat sleeve that some claimed bore the initials EF. Whether coincidence or not, such finds only deepened the story's hold. The Laramie Sentinel, revisiting the legend in 1898, wrote, "Wyoming's plains are wide, but memories cling tight to their shadows. The Finch Hollow well remains closed, but not forgotten." By the turn of the century, the story of Finch Hollow had shifted from whispered warning to a kind of regional folklore. Travelers carried it along stage routes and railway stops, changing the details with each retelling. Some said Elias Finch had been a prospector who struck a secret vein of ore. Others insisted he'd buried men alive for trespassing on his land. The truth, as always, had vanished into the soil. In 1900, a county survey project sought to reassess abandoned properties. The new clerk assigned was Miss Lillian Gray, a methodical woman known for her attention to detail. Her field notes from August 1900 include an entry titled, "Vacant Lot Number 47, Finch Hollow. Ground appears stable but unusually cold. Grass growth sparse. The former well site has settled by approximately 1 foot since the last record. Found fragments of rope beneath surface layer, coarse, untreated hemp, remarkably preserved." Lillian's supervisor instructed her to rebury the fragments, marking the location with a small wooden stake. She complied, though her later correspondence suggests she was uneasy about the task. In a letter to her sister in Denver, she wrote, "I stood there alone longer than I meant to. It felt like someone was still waiting for me to finish writing." Her report was filed and forgotten, but within months, a minor earthquake struck the region. Not enough to damage buildings, but strong enough to rattle windows and shift shallow soil. When a ranch hand checked the ridge afterward, he found that the gravel mound covering the old well had split open slightly, forming a crack like a mouth. Soon after, riders reported seeing faint light seeping through the fissure at night, not firelight, but a pale, bluish shimmer. The locals avoided the ridge again. For them, the place had never truly lost its curse. The Cheyenne Tribune ran a short article in February 1901, headlined "Echoes from Finch Hollow." It referenced the long-dead hermit and compared the persistent unease to "the wounds left by the Johnson County War, old grudges that refused to rest." The piece concluded soberly, "Men bury their violence as they bury their dead. The earth, in time, brings both back up." That spring, a traveling preacher passed through the region and held a small outdoor service near the site. He claimed it was to quiet the ground. According to the few attendees, the air was calm until he began his prayer. Then the wind rose sharply, scattering his notes. When the service ended, one woman noticed the preacher's hands were coated with fine red dust that he couldn't wash off. By 1902, the county finally reroaded the nearby trail, officially cutting Finch Hollow off from the main road. Maps from that year stopped labeling the property at all. The ridge was left alone again, reclaimed by grass, wind, and silence. But one final entry appeared in the town registry that autumn in a hand barely legible. "Stranger seen near Hollow. Said he was looking for water. Match no description. Spoke my name before I gave it." No one ever signed that entry. In 1903, Finch Hollow seemed to have slipped from memory altogether. The newer generation, born after the worst years of the range conflicts, treated it as an old ghost story, something their parents mentioned only when warning children not to wander too far. Yet even forgotten places have a way of pulling people back. That summer, a pair of prospectors, William Cates and Jonas Rudd, camped near the ridge. They were veterans of the northern mines, men used to isolation. Their surviving logbook, discovered decades later among the county's archived papers, recounts their brief and uneasy stay. Evening, June 7th. Ground solid, though the air hums faintly at night. Feels like distant water underfoot. Jonas swears he saw light from the old well, but I think it was heat shimmer. June 9th. Awoke to the sound of scraping metal. Went to look. The surface where the well once was seems freshly disturbed. No prints, no animals. Just turned soil. The final entry, dated June 10th, reads, "Jonas went to fetch water and hasn't returned." Days later, a search party found Cates wandering south of the ridge, delirious and dehydrated. When asked what had happened, he simply muttered, "He went down to help them." Cates never recovered his senses, dying weeks later in a hospital in Rawlins. The coroner's note listed heat exhaustion, but his fingernails were caked with black clay. That event rekindled public curiosity. Reporters from Cheyenne and even Denver visited the area, hoping to piece together the story. One journalist, Henry Tolliver, published a long feature in the Frontier Monthly titled "The Man Beneath the Plains." In it, he summarized the history of Finch Hollow, from Elias Finch's reclusion to the Brigg disappearance. framing it as a parable of the isolation that doomed the early homesteader. Tolliver's writing was calm and reflective, not sensational. Midway through his essay, he referenced the Johnson County War, noting how its echoes still haunted Wyoming's empty lands. The feud between ranchers and settlers was never truly settled by bullet or by pen. Men like Finch were only symptoms of a larger sickness, the loneliness that the frontier left behind. The article was well received, reprinted in several small papers across the West. For a brief moment, the story became less ghostly and more human, a symbol of forgotten hardship, not horror, but as quickly as it surfaced, it sank again. By 1904, Finch Hollow was unmarked on maps once more. The land's ownership transferred quietly to the state for non-productive agricultural value. Locals who passed by claimed to feel no fear anymore, just emptiness. Yet a few wagoners said the silence there was too perfect, as though waiting for something to disturb it again. One old drover, quoted in a 1905 letter to a friend, put it this way: "You ride through plenty of quiet in Wyoming, but that place, it's quiet, feels awake." And that perhaps was the truest legacy of Elias Finch, a silence that remembered. The next chapter in Finch Hollow's strange history came unexpectedly in 1906, when the state initiated a minor hydrology survey to map underground water channels across the western plains. Among the hired crew was engineer Patrick Leary, a recent graduate from the University of Wyoming. Leary's assignment was simple: take depth readings at various dry wells and abandon claims. One of those points, listed without any context, was the long-forgotten vacant claim number 47. Leary reached Finch Hollow on June 3rd, accompanied by a single assistant, George Mellon. His surviving field notes, preserved in the Wyoming State Archives, are remarkably detailed. Site found per coordinates, ground irregular but stable, surface covered with fine gravel, temperature difference of 9 degrees cooler than surroundings, subsurface reading faintly echoes, source unclear. That same evening, Leary wrote again. The instrument registers a repeating sound, like a heartbeat through stone. Mellon insists it's groundwater, but I disagree. The vibration feels deliberate. The next morning, the two men began a shallow excavation where their readings were strongest. At about 3 feet deep, they uncovered old timbers, soaked, soft, and black with age. Beneath them lay a thin layer of clay and several fragments of corroded iron, perhaps remnants of the well's former framework. But what caught Leary's attention most was the smell. Not rot, not sulfur, he wrote, but something faintly metallic, like rust and old blood. That afternoon, Mellon reportedly refused to dig further. In his later affidavit, he claimed the ground began to breathe, the soil rising and falling slightly, though there was no wind. The two men left the site abruptly and camped a mile away. By dawn, Mellon was gone. Leary's account ends there, but a second report filed 3 days later by a passing postal rider noted finding a sing. Latent, still standing near the ridge, Leary's notebook resting on a stool, pages weighted with stones. The last line, written in his hand, read simply, "It is deeper than the well." The state survey recorded both men as missing. The file was closed under environmental hazard, citing possible sinkhole collapse. Yet, within Cheyenne circles, the story spread fast. The following autumn, the Casper Herald published a small editorial titled Wyoming's Hollow Earth, which mentioned the Finch case alongside other local anomalies. "No frontier ever stays buried," it wrote. "From the feud at Johnson County to the echoing wells of Rock Creek, Wyoming remains a land where the past refuses to settle." After the disappearance, the state quietly redrew its maps, omitting claim number 47 entirely. By 1908, the ridge existed only as a topographic contour, stripped of its name and history. Still, ranchers swore that when rain came heavy in late summer, water would gather in that hollow, swirling briefly before draining straight into the ground, without ever filling. And though no records show anyone digging there again, the nearby soil stayed colder than any surrounding field, as though something deep below still held the chill of unbroken shadow. By 1909, Finch Hollow had become one of those places only old maps remembered. The state's decision to omit its name was meant to close the chapter for good, but word of mouth carried its ghost onward. Hunters, ranchers, and surveyors would still refer to the ridge when orienting themselves, using it as a landmark, though few actually approached. That spring, Professor Nathaniel Kerr, a geographer from the University of Colorado, led a team westward to study subsurface formations left from glacial runoff. He wasn't searching for Finch Hollow, but fate, or perhaps geography, led him there anyway. In his correspondence later published in the Rocky Mountain Review, he described his surprise at finding a depression that matched no current geological record, yet bore clear evidence of human alteration. "The circle measures near 30 feet across," he wrote, "and the soil within it is lighter, whiter, as though bleached from within. We dug 6 inches and found the scent of iron unmistakable. Beneath, compacted sand, as though compressed by great weight." Local ranchers warned Kerr not to camp there overnight, telling him of the well's history. He brushed it off as superstition. But one of his students, Ernest Lowe, recorded an unnerving account in his personal diary. "Professor's tent shook though there was no wind. The ground hummed softly, steady as a breath. I lay awake until dawn. At first light, everything was still, but the professor's boots were damp, though he hadn't stepped near water." In Cheyenne, Kerr's report stirred brief scientific curiosity. He speculated that Finch Hollow sat atop a collapsed aquifer, or a system of ancient drainage channels connecting to the region's underground streams. His findings were never officially followed up, partly due to funding shortages, partly due to growing unease among local workers who refused to revisit the site. By 1910, as Wyoming moved deeper into the new century, the land changed hands quietly once again. The property was leased to the Wyoming Agricultural Development Trust, a short-lived enterprise experimenting with dry farming. One of their foremen, Frank Dillard, tried to plant barley and jawar across the ridge that spring. His field log from June reads, "Soil won't take seed. Every furrow fills itself overnight. Found 3 patches of gray dust where grain should be." A month later, Dillard and his team abandoned the site. The company later cited unsuitable soil composition, though a letter sent privately to the board was more direct. "Men won't work the field. They say the ground sounds hollow when struck, and tools go missing by morning." Within the decade, the ridge was returned to state control, this time without contest. By then, few alive even remembered the name Elias Finch, yet something of him lingered. A drifter passing through Rock Creek that winter told a barkeep he'd seen a man at dusk standing on the ridge, thin, bearded, dressed in black, looking down into the ground. When the barkeep asked if the stranger had spoken, the traveler shook his head. "No," he said, but he nodded, like he knew I'd come too close. In the summer of 1911, Finch Hollow drew attention again, this time not from settlers or scholars, but from the Wyoming Historical Preservation Committee, newly formed to document early homesteads and notable landmarks. Among their volunteers was a young archivist named Edwin Rowe, who had read the Frontier Monthly feature about Elias Finch years earlier as a student. He saw the site not as superstition, but as forgotten history worth preserving. Rowe's team arrived in late July. What they found surprised even them. The ridge was nearly overgrown, wild grass reclaiming every trace of past life, yet the soil inside the old well's circle remained bare, smooth and pale, untouched by vegetation. Rowe's notes describe an unusual symmetry to the clearing, as if the land itself maintained the shape it once held. "No visible well," he wrote, "but the impression of its outline remains perfect, as if pressed into the ground from beneath rather than above." The team camped nearby for 3 nights, documenting artifacts found within a half-mile radius: fragments of brick, a rusted chain link, a small tin plate, and what appeared to be a corroded buckle. Rowe labeled each carefully and photographed the site using an early bellows camera. One photograph captured faint lines across the soil, not cracks, but concentric rings, like ripples frozen in dust. During their stay, several oddities were noted: Their compass needles twitched unpredictably near the hollow, and sound seemed muted within a small radius, though the wind outside the circle blew normally. On the third night, one member, Mr. Hollis Payne, claimed to hear a knocking sound, like a bucket against stone coming from underground. Rowe dismissed it as imagination, though his final journal entry betrays a flicker of doubt. The men are uneasy. I cannot explain the sound. It came thrice, and the ground beneath my sea. Hair trembled as though something deep below shifted. When they returned to Cheyenne, the committee reviewed Rowe's materials, but decided against pursuing excavation. A note in the margin of their minutes reads, "Avoid sensationalism. The public associates this area with superstition." The artifacts were boxed and stored, later misplaced during a 1913 flood that destroyed part of the records office. Still, Rowe never quite let the story go. In 1915 he published a small essay titled Forgotten Plains, in which he reflected on the loneliness of abandoned land. Halfway through the piece, he referenced both the Johnson County War and Finch's disappearance, writing, "Where blood once marked the grass and silence later filled the wells, Wyoming keeps its secrets. We record the wars, not the men who went mad beneath their echoes." After that, Finch Hollow slipped once more into quiet. The next census listed the surrounding region as unsettled. The trail leading there was erased from official survey maps. But locals still told stories, not of ghosts, but of a strange stillness that overcame travelers crossing the ridge. Some said their horses would stop, refusing to move until turned around. Others swore they'd hear faint clanging underfoot, as if someone were still at work far below. And once in a while a rancher would ride past after dusk and glimpse for just a moment the flicker of a lantern swaying gently in the dark. By 1916, only a few scattered homesteads remained in the Rock Creek region. The world had changed. Automobiles replaced stagecoaches, telegrams replaced letters, and the country edged toward the Great War. Yet in Wyoming's high plains, time still seemed to hold its breath. That summer, a drought struck the county. Wells across the area began to dry up, prompting farmers to test for deeper water veins. Among them was Harold Coyle, a young rancher, barely 22, who had inherited a patch of land just a few miles from the old Finch property. His surviving notebook, found in a family trunk in the 1970s, mentions the ridge briefly. Locals say there's a deep water line running beneath that hollow. They also say it's cursed. I'm not much for ghost stories, but I could use the water. Coyle and two hired hands began digging at the lowest point of his field. They didn't know that the underground fault line extended toward Finch Hollow, or perhaps they did, and ignored the warning. Over several weeks they made steady progress, striking compact clay, then a layer of black soil that smelled faintly of metal. On the morning of August 3rd, they broke through into something hollow. According to Coyle's later statement to the sheriff's office, a rush of air escaped the ground with a hiss, like steam, but cold. One of his men leaned close with a lantern and swore he saw something glint far below. Not water, but polished stone. Moments later, the ground beneath them gave way. Coyle barely managed to scramble clear as the pit collapsed. The other two men were not so lucky. When rescuers arrived, they found the bodies half buried, their skin pale and damp, though the soil around them was dry. The official report attributed the accident to an unmapped cavern collapse, and the site was quickly sealed. But a note appended by the sheriff, written privately in the margin, added, "Ed, same ground as the Finch matter. God help us if it opens again." The incident reached Cheyenne papers briefly before being overshadowed by news from Europe. Only one small editorial in the Wyoming Eagle reflected on the strange coincidence. The land between Rock Creek and the northern ridge seems cursed with hunger. It swallows men and leaves no trace but stories. We might laugh at the superstition, were it not that the ground keeps proving itself hungrier than our doubts. Later that autumn, Coyle left Wyoming altogether, selling what remained of his property for almost nothing. His last letter to a friend in Laramie contained a chilling line. "I still hear it at night, that hollow wind through the ground. It sounds like someone breathing, slow and steady, waiting to be heard." After that, No more incidents were recorded in the county ledgers. Finch Hollow vanished again from official attention, like a wound scabbed over but never healed. Yet locals who passed the ridge at dusk swore the wind. There had a rhythm all its own, rising and falling in time with footsteps no one could see. By 1917, Wyoming had begun sending its young men overseas, and the old frontier silence returned to the plains. The towns were quieter, the saloons half empty, and the prairies once again seemed to belong to the wind. With so many gone, no one had reason or courage to visit the ridge anymore. Finch Hollow slept under its veil of grass and dust. That spring, however, a traveling priest named Father Lionel Quinn passed through Rock Creek on his way to perform blessings for drought-stricken farms. He was an Irish immigrant, soft-spoken, and known for chronicling unusual local legends in his parish notes. In one of his letters to a colleague in Denver, he described being told of a valley the locals avoid, where the ground remembers too much. Naturally curious, he went to see it. "I found no well, no house," he wrote, "only a hollow, like a shallow bowl. The air there was still, the soil pale as bone. My horse refused to cross the ridge. I prayed aloud, and in that moment a small tremor passed through the ground. I thought it thunder, but the sky was clear." Father Quinn left a small wooden cross planted near the site and recorded his visit among a collection of field notes he titled Testimonies of the Western Frontier. Those papers, discovered in the 1950s, describe many strange but verifiable places across the early territories. His mention of Finch Hollow stood out, if only because of its tone, not fearful, but mournful. "I felt sorrow there," he wrote. "Not malice, not haunting, but a great loneliness, as though the land itself grieved what men had done upon it." By midsummer, a railway worker repairing telegraph lines a few miles south reported a faint tremor, followed by what he described as a low ringing sound from the ground, as if from a struck bell. Engineers dismissed it as vibration from the passing freight train. Yet, on that very night, a minor landslide occurred along the ridge. The next morning, a rancher discovered that a small portion of the hollow had caved in again, exposing dark, wet clay below. The state geologist inspected it briefly and concluded it was a shallow subsidence, harmless. But he also recorded an odd detail. The clay smelled of iron and salt, and the temperature at the depression's center was 10 degrees cooler than the air above it. After that, the county filled the area once more and fenced it off permanently, marking the boundary as restricted land. No official reason was ever stated, though one clerk's note in the archive reads, "In the interest of safety and sanity, leave the hollow closed." When Father Quinn passed away 2 years later, his diary ended with a final reflection that scholars still quote today. "There are places where the earth keeps confession better than men do. Finch Hollow, I believe, is one." And with that, the story nearly faded again, though not entirely. Because by the time the 1920s rolled in, the railroad crews working nearby began reporting something new, a faint pulse through the steel rails at night, steady and rhythmic, felt only when the wind stopped blowing. By 1919, Wyoming's prairies were quieter than ever. The war had ended, and the returning soldiers found a land that seemed older than they remembered, more empty, more reluctant to speak. Finch Hollow, by then sealed for nearly a decade, remained fenced and forgotten, the cross Father Quinn had planted now half buried in dust. That autumn, a small team of railroad surveyors was tasked with extending a spur line north toward Medicine Bow. Their leader, Foreman Walter Dean, was meticulous about record-keeping, and his logbook, now preserved in a Cheyenne collection, documents a strange interruption near the ridge. October 11th reached the restricted ground marked unsafe. Barbed fence partially down. Measured vibration through soil, steady, rhythmic, every 12 seconds. October 12th. One of the men, Haskett, says he heard hammering underfoot while driving a stake. No other reports. Soil cold to touch. Dean, practical and skeptical, assumed an underground water movement or residual stress from prior collapses. He ordered the men to continue. Yet later that night, while camped nearby, several of them awoke to a deep, hollow sound, like a bucket striking stone. When they looked outside, their lanterns flickered dimly, though there was no wind. By morning, the men refused to work. Dean's final note about the incident reads, "Pulled camp early. One worker claims to have seen light under the ground. I told him it was phosphorescence, though truthfully, I saw it too." That winter, heavy snow buried the ridge entirely. Locals said the drifts there lasted weeks longer than anywhere else, the frost holding even as the rest of the plains thawed. It was around this time that the first attempts to chronicle Wyoming's darker frontier stories began appearing in print. Among them was Dr. Clara Winslow's second publication, an unexpected return to the subject that had once haunted. In her article, Echo Wells of the American Frontier, was published in 1920 and drew heavily from her earlier encounter at Finch Hollow. She wrote, "Though decades have passed, I cannot forget the quiet of that place. It was not the silence of death, but of something waiting to be heard. I believe Finch was less mad than lonely, a man swallowed by the same hunger that consumed the range wars, an emptiness the land itself learned to echo." Winslow mentioned the Johnson County War again, linking its violence to the psychology of isolation. "The prairie," she wrote, "does not forgive. It simply remembers in ways we do not understand." Her article ended with an observation that some later considered prophetic. "There will come another day when the ground there shifts, and when it does, it will bring up not ghosts, but the truth that still breathes below." No one returned to test her claim. The land was left alone through the early 1920s. Fences rotted, roads faded, and the well's exact location slipped from all but a few aging memories. But train engineers working the new line sometimes spoke of an odd tremor through the rails when passing near the ridge, a vibration they swore was too regular, too human. "Like a heartbeat under the ground," one said. "Faint, but you feel it if you stop to listen." By 1922, the last generation who remembered Elias Finch by name had either left or passed on. Wyoming's frontier had turned toward modernity, cars rattling down gravel roads, electric lights flickering in Cheyenne's windows. But in the far ridges north of Rock Creek, time stood still. Finch Hollow remained fenced and overgrown, a quiet scar on the prairie that no one bothered to claim again. That summer, a small wildfire swept across the area after a lightning strike. It burned for 2 days, consuming dry grass and fence posts, but mysteriously sparing the circular patch where the old well had once been. When a surveyor visited afterward to assess the damage, he found the soil inside the ring uncharred, cool to the touch, and perfectly smooth, as though rain had fallen only there. He filed his report, noted the anomaly, and moved on. Yet weeks later, he wrote privately to a colleague in Denver. "There's something peculiar about that ground. It's as if the fire passed around it, not over it. The center smells faintly of iron. I could swear I heard dripping below, though the earth was dry." By autumn, the region's railroad crews noticed the faint rhythmic tremor again, just as Dr. Clara Winslow had predicted in her 1920 essay. When engineers inspected the tracks near the ridge, they found the rails vibrating slightly, though no trains were passing. The phenomenon lasted only minutes before fading. It was dismissed as ground settling. Locals who lived nearby told quieter versions. One ranch hand claimed he saw a flicker of light where the hollow used to be, steady, white, and low to the ground, like a lantern swaying in someone's hand. Another swore he heard the faint creak of rope in the wind, even though the air that night was still. The story never truly died. It just blended with the land's other memories. By the late 1920s, the name Finch Hollow appeared only in Tiantan, or remaining records, one old county ledger and one forgotten essay by Winslow. Yet the ridge itself endured, untouched, its outline visible from the trail only when the grass grew thin in winter. A final newspaper note, printed in the Cheyenne Tribune in 1930, marked the quiet end of the legend. Northern Ridge property, long restricted, to remain unused. Soil judged unstable. Locals still avoid area. No further development recommended. But those who'd been there, rail workers, old farmers, and the descendants of ranchers who once rode past the ridge, said they knew better. They spoke of nights when the prairie fell silent all at once, when even the crickets stopped, and a sound like a slow, deliberate hammering rose faintly from beneath the ground. And so, even as maps forgot its name, Finch Hollow endured, in stories whispered across the plains, in the chill that settled when the wind died, and in the notion that somewhere beneath that Wyoming soil, the old hermit's well still waited. Waiting for the next curious soul to listen long enough to hear it breathe.